Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this little program tonight about the 40 Thieves. I always like to begin tonight to get everyone in the proper frame of mind with a story that didn't make the book. It's one of Marvin Strombo's stories.
Excuse me, could you get closer to the mic?
Certainly. Okay. So I always like to start these programs with a story from Marvin Strombo. He's here on his 96th birthday, and here he is on Saipan in 1944. And he wanted to show off his bony ribs because he'd just gotten out of the infirmary with a bout of dengue fever. And he wanted everybody to see how much weight that he lost when they have photographic evidence of it. But this story didn't make the book, basically, because it didn't happen. It happened before the Battle of Saipan. It happened between Guadalcanal and Tarawa when the 6th Marine Regiment was stationed on New Zealand. And in July of 1943, the Marines stationed there were told to expect a visiting VIP. So in the minds of all of these 18 and 19 hormone-raging boys, they all were hoping that the visiting VIP might be Rita Hayworth, the sex goddess. So it was about a month for it, for the VIP to arrive. And as the scuttlebutt circled around, the wish and the hope became veritable fact that Rita Hayworth was coming to visit them. So it's August 1943, the plane's landing, hundreds of Marines are on the tarmac waiting to catch a glimpse of Rita Hayworth. So the plane lands, they roll up the stairway, the door opens, and out steps Eleanor Roosevelt. Marvin Strombo said that they gave her such a bad reception, a rude reception, booze, catcalls, hissing, raspberries, that they really gave her a rough welcome to New Zealand, which prompted the quote that begins the book from Eleanor Roosevelt. "The Marines I've met around the world have the cleanest bodies, the filthiest minds, the highest morale, and the lowest morals of any group of animals I've ever seen. Thank God for the United States Marines." And I should add that her son James was a Marine. She even went further to suggest that the Marines were such wild barbarians that they should all be quarantined for a year before they're allowed back into the United States. And when I told Marvin that, he shrugged. She was probably right. So this journey of the 40 Thieves was a literal journey, but it all began at my father's funeral. Everybody knew that Dad was a Marine in the Pacific. It was pretty evident that he was a retired colonel from all of the correspondence that he would receive, but he never talked about the war. He would talk about his first posting aboard the USS Maryland. He'd talk about being on Iceland, where he met his first round of Marine buddies. He'd talk a little bit about New Zealand, and maybe some places that were named Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. But that was it. But at my father's funeral, when he died at the age of 96, people got up to give the standard eulogy of what a great mayor he was, what a good golfer he was. But there was one fellow, you would know him, Bill Parsons, an old family friend, got up and his eulogy just came out of the field. He said, "The first time that I met Frank Tachovsky was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And he was just a kid there, going to college in Naval ROTC, and Dad was there on the GI Bill, and he stood out because he was old. And he'd see Dad on campus from time to time. And that every Naval ROTC meeting, there'd always be this surly Marine sergeant on duty. Dress blues, stiff, crew cut, every inch a Marine. One day, he sees Dad talking to this surly sergeant, and they're laughing and joking. And he thought it strange, but didn't think anything of it until he saw it happen several more times. And he finally went up to the sergeant and said, "Excuse me, but how do you know Frank Tachovsky?" And he snapped back, "That's Lieutenant Tachovsky to you, and when you speak of him, you do it with respect. He was our platoon leader on Saipan when a Japanese tank broke through our enemy lines, and we had no weapons to fight it with. We all thought we were goners because the fire from that tank was withering. But suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, this solitary figure runs out into that fire, shoots a bazooka, disables the tank, and kills the crew inside. That was the lieutenant. He saved my life that day. He saved the life of every man in the platoon. So when you speak of him, you do it with respect." So if a pin had dropped on the carpet, you would have heard it. But, talk about kismet. If that man wouldn't have delivered that eulogy, then the wheels would never have been put in motion to even think about writing a book about my dad's service. So the first thing that I did that very night was I went online and searched Tachovsky and Saipan, and up popped this article from the 1944 Leatherneck magazine, December, Tachovsky's Terrors. It was posted by a fellow named Chris Tipton, who said, "This was my dad's platoon during World War II. Everything in it is true, except we were never known as the 40 Thieves. We were never known as terrors in the 6th Marine Regiment. We were known as the 40 Thieves." So even before I began doing anything, the title was kind of staring me in the face. So this discovery prompted me to open up Dad's footlocker, which had been sitting in the garage for years. Maybe he had opened it, maybe not, I don't know. And it was like opening up a time capsule. There were letters, all the letters that my dad ever sent to my mom, Roxy, were kept there. Medals of valor, photographs of nameless men, and his platoon rosters for Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and his scout sniper platoon on Saipan. So if you look down here, under the T's, there's a Tipton, wore an H. That's Chris's dad. Remember that H. That'll come in a topic later on. And then a little bit further up, you see her Knuppel, William F. Sargent. All I knew of Bill Knuppel was that he was an Army buddy that we would see all the time when Dad would winter in Arizona. Here's a picture of the two old leathernecks. There's Dad, there's Knuppel. And it struck me only when I began working on the book that whenever Bill would start to talk about the war, all Dad would have to say is, "Bill, those days are over," and he would tacitly comply. And that even as 90-year-old men, they still had a relationship of sergeant to lieutenant. I thought that was a little amazing. But a couple months after Dad passed away, the first thing I did was go out and visit Bill. And as opposed to Dad, who didn't talk about the war at all, he was like an Energizer bunny. He showed me, he made a 3-hour video that was professionally done. He wrote a little book called Semper Fi. He had little other stories of recounting, and I'd have him, on cassette tape recording other things that were a little bit too rasty for the 3 hours of video that he did. And one of the photos, he shared many photos with me. Here he is on Saipan with some of the guys from the platoon. That's Bill. This guy's Bobby Gene Smots. He's one of the guys that I was still alive at the time. This little guy is Lonnie Jackson, and this fellow here is the surly sergeant, Alfred Junker. And one thing that he did was tell me stories about the guys, not just what went on in the war, but about going on leave with Big Don Evans and Kona and trying to pick up 2 Army nurses, or stealing a pig so that they could have a barbecue, and the acquisition of 2 Marine recruits before they left, Hawaii, and the final Banzai. And he also talked about the forming of the platoon.
He pointed Frank Tachovsky, who's my friend. I talked to him a couple of times a week. He's dying. He's 94. He lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And he was the lieutenant. Well, he come to my tent. He said, I'm with the leader of the new Scout Sniper platoon. You're my platoon sergeant. I said, Frank, I'm only a buck sergeant. He said, you're going to be my platoon sergeant. So I was. And we went around, and he said, now we're going to get 30, I believe it was 32 men. And so he put the word out to all the battalions. He'd be coming around on such a date, and he didn't want to see the men. He just wanted to look at their record books. And I went with him. And he'd go in the field officer and say, well, I want to get the names of the guys that volunteered for the Scout Snipers. And he didn't want to talk. He just looked at the record book. Brig time. He's my man. Oh, really? Yeah, really. He took the guys that had bad records, that they had spirit, Yeah.
So Bill went on to clarify that point, in that Dad was looking for guys who, had been in brawls, maybe been drunk and brawling and rowdy, because the loser goes to the infirmary and the winner goes to the brig. And that's the kind of guy that he wanted, some guys that could think quickly and take care of themselves. And at that time, being thrown in the brig wasn't necessarily the black mark that it might be today. In fact, the Marines called brig time office hours. And you weren't a good Marine until you'd been thrown in the brig once or twice. And I think Chesty Puller even once said, take me to the brig, I want to see the real Marines. So one of the fellows that I mentioned before was big old Don Evans. He was thrown in the brig twice. Once on Guadalcanal, he got injured on Guadalcanal and got shipped to a naval hospital in the New Hebrides. And his wounds were thought to be so severe that they were going to ship him back home, but he didn't want any of that. So he jumped onto some ship that was heading back to Guadalcanal and rejoined his buddies there, and immediately got thrown in the brig. The second time he got thrown in the brig was on New Zealand after Guadalcanal, when he went AWOL for a week over a Maori girl. He referred to her as his sweater girl in reference to Betty Grable, a pinup of the day, who wore some pretty tight sweaters. Except Don's sweater girl didn't wear a sweater. So after meeting with Knuppel, I wondered, who else might be alive out of all of this. One fellow here, where is Orozco? There, Jesus Orozco. There was no record of his death. And so I looked him up. He lived in Union City, but he died a couple weeks before Dad. This is Orozco. They nicknamed him the Ipana Kid because his teeth were so brilliantly bright compared to his caramel skin color. So he was always called the Ipana Kid. And I think he was either a city council member in Union City or a member of the school board. I forget which. But so I was out of luck on him, but I did find 3 fellows that were still alive. Here we have Marvin Strombo, who is alive to actually hold his story in his hand. Also Roscoe Mullins in West Virginia. And my old Okie lived in Georgia at the time, Bobby Jean Smots. And here's a picture of them on Saipan. Here's Marvin. You want to remember that flag for later. There's Bobby Jean Smots. Here's a fellow known as Frank Manger. He's settled in the Bay Area after the war, and his daughter is here somewhere tonight. And that's Roscoe right there. But the intimate knowledge that I gained from Knuppel about the pig roast, about all of these events, were things that you'd know only if you'd been there. And because I knew it, that really made the men open up, as opposed to just, what did you do during the war? And they opened old wounds and talked about buddies dying without batting an eye. But to a man, when they talk about the horrors of the mass Japanese suicide on Marpe Point, they'd all break down. Al Junker, the surly sergeant, was there that day trying to convince a Japanese woman carrying her baby to surrender, that they would give her food and medical care and attention, but the Japanese propaganda was such that the populace was so afraid of being captured by the Marines. And that woman smiled at Al Junker, then threw her baby off the cliff and followed right behind. And that smile would haunt Al for the rest of his life. So one of the great things about Marvin was he had a great memory for names. He could put names to these anonymous faces. So there's big old Don Evans again. The heartthrob of every girl in Kansas City Southeast High School. Big man on campus. To put it in vernacular of the day, he was built like Charles Atlas. And he won the Mr. Kansas City contest, not once, but twice. Then we'll go back, and here we got Wild Bill Emmerich. He was a club fighter out of Chicago, and his head was always cocked to one side and kind of talk out of the side of his mouth like a gangster. Looked a little bit like William Bendix. Knuppel said he's the kind of guy you wouldn't want to run into in a dark alley. This fellow is August Schieber. He was a squad leader on Saipan, but after Knuppel came down with his 21st bout of malaria after the Battle of Saipan, he got sent home, and Fritz Schieber became the platoon sergeant. This guy down here is Hal Moore. He went on to wrestle in the 1950 Olympics, but got screwed out of a medal because of a scoring decision by a judge that was ruled to be invalid, and although they recognized the error, they didn't change the decision, and he lost out on at least a bronze medal. Let's see, Lonnie Jackson here. Marvin told me that he was the shortest guy in the outfit, 5'3". Needed to be 5'4" to get in the Marine Corps. First time he went, they sent him away. But he wanted to be a Marine so badly, he spent 1 week stretching himself. He tied cinder blocks to his feet and hung from a tree for a week. And when he went back in again, he noticed that the first time he had to take off his shoes to get measured, but not his socks. So he added a few layers of cardboard insurance into his socks instead. And the second time he was exactly 5'4", and he became a Marine. This fellow is John Zuziak. He's a big player here. This is Keith Clark. He's buried up in Sutter City. And right beneath him is Waylon Stevens. He's buried just at Golden Gate Cemetery down here. So the Bay Area seemed quite a hub for these fellows after the war. So I find myself driving all over the United States multiple times a year, going to West Virginia, Georgia, Arizona, Montana, and my guys were just really embracing the project and tried really hard to remember and tell anything and everything that they could remember, even though it would cause their nightmare. They all had nightmares. Marvin, told me that they were constantly living on the edge. And at night, the barracks would sound like a nut house with all of the screaming and hollering from the nightmares. Everybody had them. I don't see how anyone could not. Which made me feel a little guilty, them sharing this and causing them to relive some of the, horrors of the war, but they wanted to. They wanted to tell. And Marvin's nightmare, I was able to work into the story. Roscoe's, I was able to work into the book. But Bobby Jean Smott's nightmare happened on Saipan when he watched a Japanese soldier shoot his best buddy in the back of the head and then go running off into the elephant grass, and Bob chased him, caught him, hand-to-hand combat. On one of my visits to visit Bob, and that's his blushing bride, Alma Jean. She's going to be 100 in December. She's still alive. She just hurt herself trying to lift a 25-pound bag of fertilizer. I said, don't do that again. But on one of my visits, Alma took me aside and said, it's great that you're getting Bob to talk about these things because it's nothing that he's ever said to anyone before in his life. And then she confided in me that as a young bride, she would wake up at night to Bob choking her. How do you come to grips with that as a young, 21-year-old woman married to your high school sweetheart? They met at an Alice Chalmers tractor show when they were 14 years old. How do you explain that if you're Bob? How do you come to grips with it if you're Alma Jean? But she, God love her, had the perseverance to work through it, discover the warning signs of his nightmare, and be able to wake him before they begin. Besides the 4 guys that I was able to talk to, there were family members that I would find or found me, and they were just excited about the project as I am. This fellow here, this Frank Manger that settled in the Bay Area, I mentioned Marjorie is here tonight. He was in my dad's Tarawa platoon as well as a scout sniper. And when the book first went off to be published, I hadn't met Marjorie yet, and I had this picture of this guy who I thought at the time was Maurice Malin, because looking at old photographs of guys, you go by how they wear their hat, how their posture is. Roscoe always has a hand on a hip in a lot of his photos. But Marjorie identified that as father because of the drape of the hand. And that's her mom, Virginia. She was in the USO, and Bojangles taught her to tap dance up and down stairs. So how do you get from this to this? For 4 weeks of eating nothing but sea rations, and sometimes having to share 1 sea ration between 2 guys for a day or 2. A lot of them lost a significant amount of weight. And I also met the family of Albert Malanga, also known as the Flamingo, because he had a beautiful singing voice like Vic Damone. And his son is a great poet, and he's written some lovely poems about his father's service. And the biggest kick in the pants about this discovery of Albert Malanga was the Albert Malanga, through my initial research, died in 2004 in Coral Gables. But that wasn't our Albert Malanga. There was some notorious gangster, mobster, killer in New Jersey where he grew up, also named Albert Malanga, and that was such bad press that he decided to change his name to Albert Marshall, and he was still alive in December of 2020 after the book was published, and I had no idea he was alive, and that just, because he's in so many stories that the guys tell me, gnaws at me to this day that I didn't know about that. Back to Knuppel. He always told me that he had a buddy in the Corps who wrote a book. Okay, so I wrote a book. Somebody else wrote a book. But his buddy was Leon Uris. And they were in H Company together. And this is Uris's first novel, Battle Cry. And it's his story of his Marine Corps experiences, but everybody is given a different name. You know, names were changed, not necessarily to protect the innocent in this case. You know, Colonel Raymond Murray was known as High Pockets. Howlin' Mad Smith might have been Screamin' Joe Blow, but everybody had a different name. And in the book, Uris writes about this notorious band of thieves within the 6th Marine Regiment that he nicknamed the Foxes, and how they were encamped far away from the rest of the regiment, like the 40 Thieves were. They were off at one end because they were doing top secret stuff. How their camp was kind of like a sportsman club, that they had their own showers and a washing machine, thanks to Dad's CB buddy, K.O. Sears. You know, acquiring things through Marine methods, which is their synonym for stealing. And that they were the first in line for everything, that the guys would have to wait to go into chow until the 40 Thieves went in first. And that was, you know, that was my guys. So in the book, he writes about how this gang of thieves stole an Army colonel's Jeep. So I get really geezed up about this idea, like my guys stole an Army colonel's Jeep. I've got to learn about this. So I go to Marvin. And Marvin normally would just, you know, talk, dialogue, back and forth. But I asked Marvin, and he had to stop and pause. You know, like he was in front of the Senate subcommittee, you know, testifying against the Corleone family. And he finally said, no. And then I went to see Roscoe, and I asked Roscoe, and he just clapped his hands and laughed. So finally, my last shot was Bob Spots. And I said, Bob, did you guys ever steal an Army colonel's Jeep? And he said no. At which point, I was deflated. But then he got this little glint in his eye, which he always got when he was going to, you know, talk about something kind of salacious or naughty. And he said, it was an Army captain's Jeep. And we beat the hell out of that thing. They painted it Marine colors. They'd use it to go on booze runs, to raid, you know, other places. And they almost got caught doing it while they were driving around. But they got out of it by telling them that they had found it and were returning it. And they were hoping for a reward. Another nice acquisition from an Army colonel that was made was by the Ipana Kid, Jesus Orozco. They needed wood to build a rack for their helmets, to hold their helmets so they could take their Navy baths. The quality of a bath in those days was measured by how many helmets of water you used. And so he stole an Army colonel's chicken coop, complete with all the chickens. And of course, the MPs were first to check out these guys, if anything was ever missing, because they were always on the radar for these nefarious deeds. But the Ipana Kid had the presence of mind to scrub the wood clean of all the chicken shit and get rid of the other evidence with a nice chicken dinner. They always said that they'd steal anything that was nailed down unless they needed the nails. But this stealing stuff was kind of necessary for the Marines of that era because they were the poorest equipped branch of service. In one letter home, Frank wrote to Roxy, his wife, my mom, that it amazes me how much we do with little or nothing. And as an example, at the onset of World War II, when the Marines were going into Guadalcanal to take on the Imperial Army, who had been at war conquering the Pacific for decades, they were equipped with weapons, uniforms, and rations that were left over from World War I. So to increase their odds of victory, they became thieves out of necessity, targeting Army, Navy, whoever they could find. Families would even send them guns and ammunition in the mail. Obviously the 40 Thieves excelled at the craft to earn that nickname from their buddies in the 6th. And as I mentioned before, the euphemism for stealing was acquiring by marine methods. And our little friend Lonnie Jackson acquired via marine methods this beautiful pearl-handled pistol. And like from an Army captain, not a colonel this time. And like any kid with a new toy, everybody wanted their picture taken with it. So here's Warren Tipton. Here's Daniel Kenny, that's Bob Smott's buddy. There's Bobby Jean Smots, and that's John Zuziak. All wanted their picture taken. But one story not involving Army was the one that Knuppel told about the pig roast. So they were camped here around Parker Ranch. And one of the things that they would do weekly was Dad would take them on a 20-mile run, full packs, down to a beach down here so they could practice rubber boat landings. But Dad had been working the guys pretty hard one day, so one day he decided to treat them to a barbecue. So instead of taking the left-hand turn here, they took a right-hand turn and had a party where the Hawaiian cowboys, the Paniolos, would load cattle onto the waiting ships. They'd swim them out to shore and then hoist them on board. And at the time, Parker Ranch was one of the biggest cattle ranches in the world. So while they're there, he gives some guys some money to go down to Kailua and get some soda and beer and stuff. Other guys were sent off to forage for fruits and vegetables and other things. And other guys were sent off to hunt wild boar or wild goat, which were, ample on Hawaii. But the guys hunting came back empty-handed. Or they didn't want to come back empty-handed, but they had no luck. So they saw a farm. And in the farm, there was a pig pen. So they decided to steal this pig. They took it back to camp and cleaned it in the ocean, dug a pit, had a barbecue. Bill Knuppel said it was the best time of his life. The sun was setting. They just had this great dinner. And he said, it's hard to imagine there is a war going on somewhere else in the world. So it turns out that stealing from this farmer wasn't just a one-time deal. The fellow who would assume the mantle of platoon sergeant tells us a little bit more.
We were not allowed to kill any of the farmers' livestock. You get chickens or hogs or something like that to eat. That was a no-no. So we just broke that no-no right off the bat. We got hungry. We got shot his pig first. Shot his pig. And then we cooked that booger, see? We skinned him and took a t-shirt off and wrapped it around this pig and roasted him, see? And of course, that old sort of t-shirt wasn't going to eat, so the payoff thought it was going to eat it anyway. And we sneak up to this farmer's house. There's only one house there, this great big farmhouse, great big guy, place. We sneak up there and steal some of the stuff, understand? He had a garden and stuff like that. We'd steal stuff out of that garden. But you weren't supposed to do that, but anyway, we did it. See, we didn't want to see if we could do it, see? Anyway. But we did all kinds of things like that.
So that poor farmer was abused mightily by these guys. But the greatest acquisition of all takes us back to the Army. And before the 40 Thieves shipped out for Saipan, they were on the big island of Hawaii. They made port in Honolulu for one night. And if you want to know how you become a Marine Scout sniper without going through Scout sniper training, Bill Knuppel is going to tell us how.
But this Don Evans said, hey, boss, anybody a rank higher than him was boss. Hey, boss, he says, let's go over to to the Schofield Barracks. He said, I got some buddies from Kansas City that just landed up in was it Akuska or somewhere in Alaska, no Japs there. And they came back, and they were, now that unit was, the Army unit was up at Schofield Barracks. He said, let's go out and see my buddy, high school buddies, kids I was raised with. I said, sure, Don, let's go. So we went out there. We found us two buddies, and so we head for the slop shoot, and drinking, and Don said, well, my God, he says, you guys, doggies, you always bug out of things. He said, landing on an island, they'd never put us on an island without somebody shooting at us. And he said, why don't you come with us? He said, we don't have any idea where we're going, but you can bet there's going to be good shooting. And the guy said, oh, no. So we had a few more beers. After about the fourth pitcher of beer, they said, that sounds pretty good. So we went to the barracks, took a razor blade, cut the red braid off their caps. We took a Marine emblem off our collar and put it on their cap. Don was about 6'4", 6'6" or something, big guy. So Don went up the gangplank first, and then the two Army boys, and then me at the rear. And, you go in, you salute the flag, and I said, you just follow, do what Don does, and they did. And we got him aboard ship. So the next morning, I went up and seen my lieutenant, Frank Tachovsky. I said, hey, Tack, we picked up 2 volunteers in Hawaii. He said, you what? I said, we picked up 2 volunteers. I said, we got 2 more. He said, what are you talking about? And then I told him, oh, Jesus. He said, I don't know nothing about it. He said, I don't know. He said, just be sure they got weapons when we land. Yeah, we sure did. So Don, it was about the second day, the loudspeaker comes, now hear this, check your rifle number, so-and-so. I said, oh boy, one of the guys has got a gun now. Don, you got to meet your weapon. You stole them, yeah?
So, and here's a picture of the buddies. This is big old Don Evans. This fellow down here, number 10, is Tommy Arello. He was a track star. His nickname was The Flash. And this is Norman Dooley. He settled in Flagstaff after the war and became a prominent psychiatrist. One of the most amazing aspects of this story is how it never ends. Right after we sent the book off to the publisher, after all of the editing had been done, I get a message from Richard Zuziak, John Zuziak's son, saying, would I like to see his dad's war pictures? I thought, sure, but it's tantamount to spying to carry a camera. They weren't allowed to carry cameras, although Knuppel had one that folded up that he could hide in his breast pocket, and you wouldn't see it. And John Zuziak evidently had one. Because if you were issued photographs, it would just be, everyone would get Guadalcanal photos, Tarawa photos, Saipan photos. But the best thing about these photos that Richard shared with me is that he wrote down who everybody was under the photo. And when Smots would talk about Warren Tipton, he was 17 when he enlisted. His 18th birthday, June 15th, 1944, D-Day on Saipan. Happy birthday. And he'd talk about the kid as though he was just a little nuisance. Like in your mind's mind, you thought he was just this scrawny little kid that they had to teach how to do everything. Well, and that they gave him a nickname, something that began with an H. And here he is. Here's Warren Tipton. What a big lummox. Look, he just is so happy. He looks like a baby Huey, and his nickname was Hobart. So everyone would just call him Hobart. Another wonderful aspect of the Zuziak photos is another Smots story was about them being sent out on training missions, survival, living off the land, where they would, go up to the Koala Mountains up here and live off the land with just taking along one canteen of water. And this is Smott's story. On one of these missions, they met a Chinese rice farmer up here who showed them a viaduct through the mountain that carried sugarcane from one end to the processing plants on the other. So they waded through the viaduct, which brought them out into the Waipio Valley, very verdant farmland. Then he showed them the three fingerlet canyons cut into the side of the island, and how Japanese submarines would dock in one of those fingerlets and get resupplied by the off-limits village of Pololu. Pololu was declared off-limits to all military personnel because the village was filled with Japanese sympathizers, so much so that all of the men had been sent to internment camps. So the boys figure, what the hell, they're going into Pololu, and the old woman who ran the general store there was the head spy. And she had a radio so she could communicate with the ships offshore, the submarines, and send them, information, or when it was safe to come in to resupply. So they're carousing there, living it up. The old woman arranges some girlfriend types for them, as Bob Smots would say, but Roscoe went a little bit farther and called them geishas. We have a little bit more of a salacious connotation to geisha than what it really means. So they're, the girls are liking it too because there are no boys there. So they're having fun. They're living it up until the head of the Hawaiian Home Guard hears about it, who lived just north of Pololu, comes there, roots them out, takes them home to his house, where he gives them a cup of coffee and sends them back to camp and tells them he's going to tell Howlin' Matt Smith all about it. So, Bob Smott's story, great story. Photographic proof. Here is a picture of Waipio Valley that Zuziak took. This is the only time that he could have taken that, was when they came through that viaduct, because there would have been no other reason for him to be up on top of the Koala Mountain and have this view of the Waipio Valley. Here is a picture of the guys with just women and children. This fellow is William Knipe. He was a squad leader. Carlos Lane, the Ipana kid, and everyone knows the lean of that neck is Wild Bill Emmerich. The little old lady who ran the general store treated the guys so well that they called her Mom. And, we're talking, when we initially wrote this about the geishas, I used, every chapter starts with a quote, and this chapter begins with Roscoe's quote, "When you've got a geisha, you've got it made. They are the best in the world." And now we had to cut it right there, because he went on to say, "I wouldn't trade one geisha for all the whorehouses in Texas." It's a little bit more salacious than we wanted to go, especially when, here are the girlfriend types. Aren't they just the prettiest little girls that you've ever seen? And they gave them all Americanized names. And they liked the attention of, the boys too. They would have mock military weddings. There's Carlos Lane with Eleanor. And they were even sent home with autographed pictures to Zuziak from Myrtle. And to top it all off, here they are at the head of the Hawaiian Home Guard's house. It's Venancio Valenciano. He's buried in Nevada. Bobby Jean Smots, Wild Bill, Big Old Don, Ipana Kid. And because Zuziak wrote down names, I know that head belongs to Charles Fields. So we immediately had to go in and rewrite the whole chapter, just after we sent it off. But even more recently, the family of Fritz Schieber has reached out to me, and it must have something to do with being the platoon sergeant, because he was just as informative as Knuppel. And his family made all of the videos, not as high of quality as Knuppel's, but I've gone through 3 of the 9 hours of videos so far, and photographs, and names and addresses, which would have been helpful if I'd found them first for locating some of the other men. But the most interesting thing that happened with the discovery of Fritz Schieber is that the Scout snipers were probably the first US troops to use night vision technology. It was so top secret, they waited to give it to them until they were aboard the USS Bolivar, and they blocked out a cargo hold so they could use it, and here Fritz tells us about it.
Then we had some other equipment that I never heard of, and it was brand new, and it made in Indianapolis, Indiana, what they called a sniper scope and also super scope. And what it was, you could see at nights real good, and it didn't shine a light. You couldn't see it. If somebody was using it, didn't throw a flashlight or anything, see. And you could see 50 yards away, real plain. But everything looked green in there. And on this super scope, they also made them for sniper scopes. You could mount them on a rifle and shoot it at nighttime. And no one could see that you were watching them, see. And we thought that was really something then. You know, you could see at night and nobody could see it. It was like a flashlight that was shining around. And it had a little battery on there, about 8 or 10 inches wide, maybe 2 inches thick, and 10 or 12 inches tall. It's a wet cell battery, like a car battery. And it put out 4,000 volts in a little wet cell. And 4 little, and the side of the battery had little eyeglasses that you could see in there. 4 little tubes had different colored bulbs in there. And this battery would last 4 hours of continuous running. Or it could last all night. You didn't just turn it on and hold it on, see. But you just use it spasmodics anyhow. Put it in a little backpack. It didn't weigh hardly anything. With a big wire coming over to your scope. You had the super scope was this one you could hand and look like this. But on the sniper scope it was on your rifle. And I forget now, they told us whenever if you ever lost this thing or got shot or something, why destroy this thing right away, because it was top secret and they didn't want anybody to know we had it, see. So I forget now, real quick you just did some little thing and that thing would just blow up and just melt it out, see. So,
Kind of like Mission Impossible, where poof, and it's destroyed. The first mentions that I could find of night vision technology in the Pacific were on the later battles of Iwo Jima and or Okinawa, I forget which. So obviously, these guys were the guinea pigs for the technology. I found that really interesting. Now, for most of these guys, the war ended in August 1945 when the Japanese surrendered, but not for Marvin Strombo. You hear these, I don't know if it was apocryphal stories about these moments in battle where a voice whispers to you, move, and you do, and a bullet whizzes past your head. Well, Marvin had that same experience in June of 1944 on the outskirts of Garapan with a dead Japanese captain. He saw him lying on the ground, and he saw his Yosagaki Hinamaru sticking out of his jacket. The good luck flag was something that every Japanese soldier carried with them that was very sacred to them. Their whole family in the village would sign their name and wish them well, and they even thought that the soul of the soldier himself was embodied in that flag. And he thought that that was so sacred that he didn't want to take it. But then he thought, well, if I don't take it, somebody else will. And if I take it, I may be able to get it back to the family someday. And here's Marvin holding up that flag that he kept for decades. And in August of 2017, Marvin Strombo returned the flag of Captain Sadeo Yasui to his youngest brother, Tetsuya. And when Tetsuya received the flag, he took it, held it to his face, inhaled deeply, and said, "You've taken good care of my brother." So, to wind everything up tonight, we're going to hear a little vocalistic stylings of Albert Malanga, the Flamingo. The piece that you're going to be hearing is called My Life's Companion. And even though it's a love song, it could be very well said about his Marine Corps buddies, because the vows that you make to a spouse are not unlike what buddies in the Corps did for each other, through thick and through thin, through richer or poorer, through sickness and health, until death do they part. Now, the video that I'm going to be showing, focus on the audio because it's an old clip that we used to promote the paperback, but the audio quality is really good.
My life's companion, and you'll never grow old. I'll love you so much that you'll never grow old. When there's joy in living, you just never grow old. You've gotta stay young, 'cause you'll never grow old. People who are lonely can be old at 33. Don't let that happen to you. Don't let it happen to me. Be my life's companion and you'll never grow old. I love you so much that you'll never grow old. Love and youth and happiness are yours to have and hold. Be my life's companion, be my life's companion, and you'll never grow old.
That's all, folks.
So, ladies and gentlemen, what an outstanding event. Do we have any questions from the audience? There's got to be something.
I might add that both Marvin Strombo and Bob Smots identified this as Bob Smots. And these are probably Evans and two of his buddies. I said there was going to be no spoiler alerts. Damn it, I just gave a spoiler.
Outstanding. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I guess this concludes our event if there aren't any questions. However, Joe has got books that he's going to sell and be more than willing to sign over here on my right-hand side at that table. And let me tell you something real quick. Anecdotally, I read the book. I read all the books for these Meet the Authors. And this book was fascinating. And this was the only book that I've actually read twice. And the escapades, if you will, of his dad and those 40 thieves, I'll tell you what. What do you think? Should we have an honorary 40th thief?
We will.
Joe and I counted chairs earlier, and you're probably not going to like this, but you're in chair number 40. And so, oh, and he's got a question too. This is like bonus on a game show, except I'm not wearing my glasses. No, we have a special gift for you.
It's parked outside.
It's next to Hobo Joe. Is there a sequel that is going to be written about the book and your father?
Well, there has been so much information that has been gained since the publishing of the book that I'd really like there to be a second edition. So I'm working on organizing that. For instance, let's see, can I go back to the, well, on the, well, I will go back to the roster. Why not? So up here, there's this Hodnicki. It's like Hal or H.A. something. I couldn't find a Hal Hodnicki or any type of Hodnicki in the Marine Corps at all. Thanks to Fritz Schieber, who had everybody's names and home addresses, I did find a Joseph Hodnicki, hospital apprentice, first class. He was the corpsman for the 40 Thieves. He was just 17 years old. He didn't turn 18 until June 22nd, a week into battle. Imagine being a 17-year-old kid and having to be a corpsman on the beaches of Saipan on D-Day. So that's just one bit of information. And there were stories about the Hodnicki. Don Evans would write home about him, about this little virginal pharmacist mate that they acquired, and how he's having the time of his life. So I'm hoping to have a second edition out.
And we're certainly looking forward to that. And ladies and gentlemen, I guess if there's no other questions, going once, twice. Mr. Mike Rogers.
I have a question, but I didn't like it.
All right, it figures. Marine Corps.
You know, I'm just curious, first of all, I think it's a wonderful tribute to your father and his men that you're telling. And my question would be, what would he say to you about you telling his story?
Well, it's very funny. Being part Hungarian and gypsy, I have these really prescient dreams where you're not just dreaming of them, you're conversing with them. And I remember telling Dad about the book, and he said, "Jesus, Joe, how in the hell did you do that?" I think he would be, although not happy about it, because he never thought he was deserving of anything that he ever done. He'd always say he didn't do anything any other Marine wouldn't have done. But I think he'd be really as happy and proud as the other four guys of Bill Knuppel and Marvin Smots. And when Marvin was dying, his daughter called me and said, Daddy's dying. So next day I get in the car and go and visit him before he passed away. And I was leaving him that night, and he stopped me and pointed at me and said, "Semper Fi." And then he died during the night. So I think he would have been proud. And I would have loved to have known his input on some of these stories. The only story that my brother had this great habit of putting photographs in front of my parents and having them recording what they're saying about it. And Roxy was a colorful character. She dated Ralph Capone Jr., Al Capone's nephew, once upon a time before, marrying Dad, and also was engaged to a Green Bay Packer, Baby Buford Ray, who is another story altogether. But where was I going with this? Help me out here. I digress. I was so paranoid about getting this under a minute because everything is a digression in the story because there's just so much to tell. But I think he would have been very happy.
Ladies and gentlemen, are there any more questions or comments? Oh, we have one here.
Well, I've known, okay. So I know Joe as Tiger because we grew up together in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. You're the greatest storyteller. Do you, I know that your brother Chuck, it just runs in the family, yes?
Well, the gregarious side, yeah, probably comes from Mom and my grandfather, who was funny guy. When he had to stop buying Nash cars and buy a small car, he'd crouch down, so ashamed of being seen in a small car. It was just terribly funny. So.
Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, thank you.
You're a lot younger than I am, so.
Yeah.
But I didn't know. It's wonderful. Yes, you come by it honestly.
Thank you.
heritage.
My
Thank
mother
you.
thanks you, and
It's
my father
Robbie's
thanks
too, she's here.
you.
Well-
I must say, Mom would be pissed off that she didn't have a bigger role in the book.
Joe is certainly the raconteur, a fellow raconteur. We like to tell stories, but with that, our event is over, and Joe will be signing books over here, and please line up on there and get one. And I'll tell you something, I've read the book and I read it twice, and he just skimmed over a few things, and I'm not going to waste a bunch of time and tell you all some of the fascinating things I read in the book, but I will leave you with this. Those young guys and gals in 1921 or 41 are still the same as in 2021 or back when I was a young guy in 1981. Times have not changed in that aspect, and there's some fascinating things in the book. So please feel free to get one and help yourself again to the wine bar. And thank you for coming out. 3 June, mark your calendars. This one's going to be pretty good because the Army Corps of Engineers, like I said, it's a fascinating group of people that are underrepresented here in the Bay Area. And if you see something weird in the Bay, there's a good chance they're taking care of it. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you and good night.